Okay, good afternoon, Dad.
Good
Today
afternoon.
is Friday, November 22nd, and we got some big stories. A lot happened in the past couple of days. I want to talk about the ICC arrest warrant with Netanyahu, but before we jump into that, let's talk about Russia's response to the NATO missile attack into
Okay.
Russia. So maybe you can just, we can talk about just what happened. What
Okay.
did Russia do?
Okay. Well, they fired a missile, one that, a very new one, one that had been under development and it just recently became ready for combat. Called the Oreshnik, right, which I think means chestnut or something like that.
Hazel, I think. Hazel.
Okay. Hazelnut. Yeah. Okay. Right.
No nuts, just Hazel.
Just hazel. Okay. I got you. Yeah. I don't know why it's called that, but yeah, it's a completely new weapon. It travels 3 kilometers a second. It's hypersonic. The reentry vehicles. It has multiple reentry vehicles. So what happens as it approaches the target is that the nose cone comes off, and then there are these smaller nose cones within, okay, that are fired from the missile, and those go, towards specific targets within the target area. And you can see that there's a video online, which I've come across many times. It'll be very easy to find, but of these reentry vehicles, these smaller nose cones striking, the ground, striking the target area in Ukraine. I think it was Dnieper Vostok or something like that. It's a city that's right on the Dnieper River, and apparently what they were hitting was a large military factory. So yeah, it's a new weapon, and it's a weapon that cannot be defended against. These these warheads, as they come in, the reentry vehicles, they're traveling at about Mach 12, as they approach and make impact. And there's just nothing. There's no system out there that could possibly stop these. And then more than that, it has a range of approximately 6,000 kilometers. So it could strike any target within Europe with impunity. So clearly, by firing this, the Russian government was making a statement, and Putin gave a speech afterwards, and he said that this was, in fact, in response to the attacks on Kursk and Bryansk regions.
From NATO.
Bryansk was ATACMS. Kursk, we're talking about Storm Shadow missiles.
Right.
Apparently, I think everybody. So far, there's no evidence that any significant damage was done in Bryansk. So I think the Ministry of Defense version of events was correct. They said that they shot down 5 or 6, and they actually deflected and damaged the sixth one. No casualties, no damage. In the case of the Kursk attack, the one that was carried out with Storm Shadow cruise missiles, apparently it was a command center. The bunker's underground. The command center was not damaged, but there was some personnel, some guards on the around the center that apparently a few of them were injured and killed. So there were some casualties in that event. So yeah, so this the big question is this all that the Russians are going to do? I listened to or I read a transcript of Putin's speech, and it seemed to me like he was saying, okay, this is our response. But then he made it very clear. He said, that further attacks, will receive an even more forceful response, and that we are entitled, that's the exact word that he used, entitled to strike into the territories of those countries that are responsible for these attacks. So in other words, he says we are entitled to strike U.S. territory or British territory. It doesn't mean that he's going to do it or that he's promising to do it, but he says we are entitled to. And looking at it in just objective terms, sure, he is entitled. They have attacked Russian territory. Russia has the right to retaliate. But we don't know if, again, if maybe this is all that he's going to do. I got that sense from his speech, but others put a different interpretation on it and seem to think that this was just the first in a series of responses and that we should expect to see more. And just recently, the head of the State Duma in Russia said that there was more coming. So we'll see. And then actually, I think I heard this morning that 2 more storm shadows were fired into Russian territory, and that both of them were brought down.
So, well, that doesn't sound good, Dad. It sounds like we are on the path of escalation. We're on the escalation escalator right now.
Right.
The use of this Oreshnik, I feel like should be it's, to me, it looked like a very strong message that Russia sent, that we can strike any city in Europe with impunity. Nothing can stop these, and these warheads can also are nuclear capable. They can be tipped with nuclear warheads. So we could blow up every single city in Europe if they wanted to, and nobody could stop them. Obviously, Russia doesn't want it, but it's sending a very firm message.
Right.
But then what you just told me, we just said, okay, well, we'll just fire a couple more storm shadows in there that aren't going to really do anything. Yeah. And then the White House Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said, "We will not be deterred. We will continue to ensure the Ukrainians have what they need on the ground." That was her response to the use of this new hypersonic missile that has nuclear warheads. I guess it's easy for the United States to say, "Oh, it's just Europe that will blow up, right? It's not us."
Right. Not very likely that anything will be fired in the direction of the U.S. Right.
So this response by Russia, first of all, was this on your bingo card? Did you see something like this coming, or
I was saying that I expected a very measured, a very limited response, and the reason that I gave was that Biden is a lame duck president, and Trump is coming in, and Trump and his people have already voiced disapproval of this new policy of the Biden administration. So the Russians are aware that, starting January 20th, there is likely, it's not certain, because, a lot of times we find out and we expect a new administration to do something differently, and they say they will, but they don't. It's not certain. They may continue doing this, but there is reason to believe, at least to be somewhat hopeful, that these strikes into Russian territory will stop then, and the Russians, understand that. So I think they have to respond, but they're going to respond very cautiously. And again, that's just Putin's nature, right? He's saying, okay, you're escalating. We've already said that we're going to respond, but we're not going to try to pour oil on the fire. We're just going to, our responses will be carefully calibrated. They'll be proportionate. And so we'll see what that means. I mean, we've talked about the Houthis. There's a chance that they may supply some ship-killing missiles to the Houthis, but they may do something directly and strike, an ammunition depot or a command center somewhere in NATO territory. I mean, that's a possibility. Or people have earlier talked about maybe they could take out a satellite or one of these drones that's always flying over the Black Sea and monitoring, or collecting intelligence on Crimea. They might take one of those down. They have options. We'll see what they do.
Well, why is the West not deterred at all? When I saw that footage of this Oreshnik missile coming down, I mean, it looked kind of like to me, almost alien. It almost looked like there was a portal opened up in the sky and zapped down, and then another one, and then another
lightning bolts. I mean, they were clearly they were descending at just extraordinary speeds. It was quite extraordinary.
Right. So for me, looking at that and just thinking that, well, if this was a nuclear warhead in there, just how terrifying that is. Right. And I just feel like if you're a European, somebody living in Europe, just like, why are we doing this? What? Right. This is scary, right? This could get real, Mm-hmm. And the response from NATO is apparently sent 2 more storm shadows that do nothing. So why?
Yeah, no. Again, it just makes here? Right. Again, there doesn't seem to be. Well, the military calculation just does not exist. There's no military logic to this, as we've said many times. as even the Pentagon itself has pointed out, there's just no military benefit to these. And you can see it. I mean, these are the great majority of these missiles are being shot down. And, if one occasionally gets through, big deal. It's not going to have any effect. It'll just be a tiny pinprick, against the Russian bear. But then the downside is huge, right? You have crossed a red line. You have provoked the Russians in a major way. The Russians do feel a need to retaliate in a way that could really hurt or at least humiliate, NATO. So why? There's just the military logic is not there. And again, I think it's clear that the Pentagon, and I think most defense establishments, I guess apparently not the British, they're just completely nuts. But most Western defense establishments are not happy about this. And it has to be pointed out that it's not all Western leaders that support this. Olaf Scholz has come out against it. That's Germany is the largest country in Europe. The Italians have come out against it. So they're the usual suspects like Poland and the Baltic states, Britain, and I'm not quite sure what France is up to. I think, they've been kind of straddling the fence on this. So I don't know if we'll see scalp missiles or not. So there is resistance. It's just, you have to ask the question, but why is the U.S. doing this in the U.K.? Why are they so gung-ho to do this when there just is no military reason to do this? There's some very powerful reasons that you would think they would understand not to do this. And again, I just think, it clearly is a political calculation. And I think part of it is what we said earlier, that the Biden administration, with the help of Keir Starmer in the UK, is trying to get, keep the war going and, actually escalating so that it'll be harder for Trump to pull out of it. I think maybe that's part of their calculation. And then the other, as some other people have pointed out, is that Biden is also, it's like giving them everything in these last 2 months so that no blame is put on him. They'll say, yeah, Biden went all out for them. You can't say, well, they asked for this and Biden give him that. He's thinking of his legacy. I think he's an idiot. In the end, history is going to judge him very harshly, and particularly for these just foolish, reckless acts that he's committed in the last 2 months of his administration. Right. But I, the guy clearly is not thinking clearly. The guy is not thinking clearly, and neither are, his Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken,
Right. I mean, I don't even know if we can even really blame Biden, because I don't think he's just thinking at all. This is a more,
Well, he does have a pretty good excuse. Dementia is a pretty damn good excuse.
Right. So,
but Blinken, clearly doesn't.
Right.
Or Sullivan.
Blinken and Sullivan, right? These guys, are these the ones that are pushing it and calling the shot?
They must, they must be. Well, we know that Blinken was earlier. It was crystal clear. He was pushing hard for this. A couple months ago, he didn't get what he wanted then.
The argument for legacy doesn't make as much sense then, right? Because it's more about the Biden legacy. They may just be wanting. Why? If I was there, I'd just be like, I'm getting out.
Right. If you're talking about if the decision really was made, it's possible though. You don't. Biden is still there in some shape or form, and he's obviously, for him, I think the Ukraine project was the most important thing of all. So he may have made this decision. We don't really know, but. Clearly he had the support of these other people. And, the question is why, okay, he always has the excuse of dementia. They don't, neither does Keir Starmer. What's going on with these guys? And all I can say, I think is partly what I've said before. It's just that they cannot get their, they went in supporting Ukraine. They tore up the Istanbul Agreement, told Ukraine, we're going to win this war. And that was their plan. And it didn't fail, and they didn't have a plan B, right? And they had that idea because they're still living in the 90s. They're still living in the unipolar moment where they could do anything without consequences. And where Russia was just was a pathetic beggar that they could kick around, as much as they wanted. And it seems like they can't let go of that. They still believe it. On some level, it's crazy, but that's where they are. That's where, that's the way they look at the world. And otherwise it's hard to explain it because this is so very reckless. In the end, it could be really have some very serious consequences for NATO and for the U.S. But they don't have it. Back during the Cold War years, there was this healthy respect and fear of the Soviet Union. We didn't we didn't love them. A lot of us hated them, but we feared them. We knew that we had to take them seriously, and we knew that they could unleash this Armageddon on us, and so we behaved in a sober fashion and worked out these these arms limitation treaties, and we made that we stepped back from the abyss. But the people who lead our governments now do not have that healthy fear. They just don't have it. Otherwise, how can you explain what they're doing? If they had that fear, if they really thought, you say, and I'll say this too, I think the chance of a nuclear war is very small. But any chance is just way too big a chance. If it's 1 in 10,000, that's much too big. 1 in 10,000, if we do this, the world ends. So, we don't do it. It just does, there's no need, especially when there's zero military benefit. What are we doing? But these people just don't have that fear. That fear is gone. And I think the Russians are trying very hard to slap them in the face, slap NATO in the face, and they just have them wake up. They're in la la land, they're in dreamland. They used to, again, NATO was a formidable opponent, and the Soviet Union feared them, right? But the fear was mutual. But now they just don't have that fear. It's just sort of like they're drunk, and the Russians are trying to sober them up. So that's why, they did this. This was a demonstration. And then afterwards, Putin gave a speech and explained, this can strike any city in Europe. And these are nuclear capable reentry vehicles. So, you saw those impacts, those extraordinary impacts, coming down like lightning bolts from the sky. Each one of those could have been a nuclear bomb. That one missile could easily take out an entire city, like all of Paris or something. And so, please, look, I'm not, it's sort of funny. Even before, every once in a while, you get some news like, boy, this guy's a madman. He's threatening nuclear war. It's just, no, he's trying to wake you up and let you know how serious all this is. He has no intention, no need. Like I've said, we thank God the Russians are as strong as they are. There's no risk that Russia is going to fall at the present time. If there was a risk, we really would be on the verge of nuclear war. But as it is, it's just, who knows? We have crazy people in the West. There always can be accidents. There is a chance, even if Russia remains strong, and it will, there is always a chance of nuclear war. It's a non-negligible chance. And the fact that our Western leaders are just ignoring this is unconscionable.
I think the problem is that we fostered this environment really starting, I think, heavily around 2015 with the whole Russiagate hoax going around Trump, that it got to the point where we create this environment where you can't even talk to Russia. There's no communications. You talked about the healthy respect back in the Cold War, but there was always lines of communication open. We were talking, we're drawing up treaties. Instead, our response is, we can't talk to Russia at all. No, not a single person. Even us, if we just try to listen, if you just listen to Putin's speech, if you just listen to it as a politician in the left West, you'll be labeled as somehow a Putin puppet. Even if you say you don't agree, it's like you can't even listen to the Russians. So it's a very dangerous environment that we've created. So I think the first step is to break that, to get out of that, to say, like, let's start talking to them. Let's and maybe that's hopefully what can cool things down with Trump, if he is able to pick up the phone and begin communicating with the Russians. But it's just, to me, it's unbelievable that the United States would take this move to shoot missiles into the world's largest nuclear superpower in the whole world. And there was no address to the American people. There was no deliberation. There was no democratic process. There was no talk. We haven't heard from Biden at all about it. This just happened, and I haven't heard of people.
Well, it's actually rather odd, They never announced that they're going to do it. Remember, it was just a leak in the New York Times.
Right.
And then
the White House hasn't ever said anything.
Yeah, and then when they're asked about it, they don't say anything. So, I think that's a reflection of maybe the profound disagreement within the administration, and maybe especially between the Pentagon and the State Department. So the Pentagon just obviously was opposed to this. So anyway, it's bizarre, and it's absolutely really insane. I mean, it's just like it's there's just no way. There's no way to justify this. There's just no way.
Right.
But they're doing.
I mean, I feel like if you made a movie about this whole scenario 20 years ago, people would just say this is a stupid movie. There's no way this could ever happen. It's so implausible.
Exactly. Well, that's true of like 90% of the stuff that happens these days. I mean, really. I mean, we just have a completely clueless ruling class. Again, it goes way beyond idiocracy. And Biden himself, I think, just embodies it better than anything. You stop, listen to his speech, and it's just this evil, demented, cognitively impaired zombie, is running the country. And they just, what the heck is going on?
Right. What is going on? I mean, I just wish people would take a step back and just look at it and just say, like, what are we doing here? Well, what is the point of this? Why should Americans care, or Europeans? Why should anybody other than the Ukrainians care about who governs Ukraine? Like, how does that affect us in the United States? Like, why is this worth destroying the whole world over, or killing all these people for? Maybe we should let the Ukrainians have a vote. Maybe we talk about democracy. Maybe let them hold elections. And see what happens.
They did have one, and actually they elected a president who wanted to maintain good relations with Russia, but the EU and the US was not happy with that, and that's why we got the coup in 2014.
Right,
and it has to be remembered that back then only 20% of Ukrainians supported NATO membership, but already the U.S. president, I guess it was back in 2008, it was George W. Bush, announced that Ukraine would become a member of NATO. Again, this was against the wishes of the Ukrainian people. So anyway, again, there's no justice. Even, this is all, all this nonsense about supporting Ukraine is always framed in terms of some kind of justice. You say, well, let's say even if that were true, just grant them that. And you say, okay, the Russians are aggressors, their invasion was completely unjustified, and so on and so forth. You grant them that, but you still have to be realistic, and you have to look at the consequences. Again, during the Cold War years, the Soviet Union clearly unjustly, and we all felt that, it invaded Hungary, suppressed a rebellion then. They did the same in Czechoslovakia. And these actions by the Soviet Union they were universally condemned by Americans and by the West in general, and I think with good reason. But nobody said, well, okay, we need to go to war over this. We need to start sending arms into Czechoslovakia or Hungary, because people, actually our leaders still had, were of sound mind, and they said, we don't like this, but we cannot risk a third world war over this. But we don't have those kind of people. So even if you say, okay, this is all unjust, this is just like the Soviet Union back in the 1950s and 1960s. Well, you still have to be realistic and avoid World War III, and for the greater good, right? You just can't decide. I mean, the way they talk, they just won't consider anything else. But I think the fact is they do not have justice on their side. I mean, that's just a lie. They've rewritten history, and but we've talked about that earlier,
right? So I am almost kind of struggling with what the mainstream narrative is on why we need to be supporting Ukraine and why we need to keep on pumping money in there. What is the reason that the political elites in DC, London, Brussels, what are they giving? Why we have to do this? Is it just because this idea if we don't, then Russia's just going to roll right all the way through into Paris and Brussels and London? Is that really the only argument they have? What are they saying?
Well, they say different things at different times, and some leaders have made that that latter argument, at least on a few occasions. Other times they just say that, well, Russia just can't get away with this. This was terrible. This was an unprovoked, unjustified, full-scale invasion. And, if anything, we at least have to make it hard for them, raise the cost for them so they don't try it again. They learn their lesson. You can't do this. But then you have other people who are saying, well, this is, and Lloyd Austin said this quite openly back in 2022, this is a chance to weaken Russia. And I think that's really what they were looking at initially, is that's why, NATO went all in on this and told Zelensky to tear up the Istanbul Agreement. Said that we can, we'll support you, you'll win. And what they're telling themselves, it's like, whatever happens, we can weaken Russia. And obviously they failed on all accounts. No matter how you look at it, they failed. But they just apparently don't have a plan B, and they just can't, they just cannot accept what's happened. So they just keep on doubling down, and so the most recent is, of course, the lifting of these restrictions. They keep on doing things they said they weren't going to do earlier, because everything they do fails. If their earlier moves had succeeded, like if supplying Abrams tanks or supplying F-16s really made a difference, then they would have stopped there. But nothing works. Nothing has made any difference at all. The Russians continue to move forward. The Russians continue to get stronger. The Ukrainians continue to get weaker. So they just keep on crossing red lines, their own red lines. And in this case, it's also a Russian red line. But it becomes more and more absurd as they go along. Like initially you think, well, maybe HIMARS will really make a difference. And for a couple of weeks they did. Maybe,
F-16s.
Abrams tanks or whatever, but
Yeah.
None of them did. But there's just no way, even the Pentagon's been saying, there's just no way this is going to make a difference. There's just no way. So why are you doing it? Just that I think you have these people, politicians who just cannot think in a rigorous way. They're just locked into narratives, and, they strike poses, and that we have to stand by Ukraine and we must be tough and whatever. And so that's what they do, because that's, that makes them look tough. That makes them, look like they're standing by Ukraine. But it doesn't actually mean anything. I'm sure there are people who try to explain to them, but I don't think people understand those kind of arguments. They just inhabit that world of political rhetoric.
Right. Well, Putin said that this regional conflict provoked by the West has now acquired global elements. So he is, he is saying that this is now that basically NATO is a co-belligerent in this war.
Yeah, well, he's made that clear many times. It's not just like he made an off-the-cuff remark once. He's probably said this at least half a dozen times. And so this is the clearest of red lines. There's just no doubt about it. And we're just ignoring it.
Yeah, but just everything you're saying right now, that there's no military strategy here, there's no real military objective, but despite that, our response is to just be ideological, or just to hunker down and just continue to demonize Russia nonstop, and we will circle the wagons. And we've already fired some more Storm Shadows, apparently, you're saying. Yeah. So do you think that this is what's going to happen? Is that despite this very clear warning from Putin, from Russia, and a display of power, that we're going to ignore it again, and then we'll continue to do what we're doing until Russia is going to have to respond again, and then it's just But then what we'll hear from the West, and so you're saying, I'm worried. Should we be worried? I mean, are you worried? I mean,
well, yes. I'm not too terribly worried right now. I guess because I was always expecting something like this was going to happen, that they were going to keep on escalating. Well, I'll just say there is reason to worry. For whatever reason, I feel calm, but I understand that we are in a very, very precarious situation. Things could go very wrong,
And just to top it off, we're talking about, we have a lame duck presidency that seems to be wanting to start a global conflict before they leave office, to give a giant dumpster fire to the incoming President Trump. That's almost what it feels like. Is that's the goal here? Like, what is the what's the thinking here? To me, it is just to escalate as much as we can, and then he bows out. And it's just, imagine being just so salty as an old man that you're willing to risk nuclear war for the whole world. That's almost what it feels like. That there's just a handful of people that have personal grudges and made bad choices and are too
and can't admit their mistakes.
Can't admit their mistakes, is too full of this Western hegemony, and that they're willing to risk it all.
Again, I don't see the problem is I think they don't really understand that they're risking it all. Like I was saying, it's just this lack of that healthy fear that existed throughout the Cold War. It's just not there anymore. And it's, maybe it's just a legacy again of the 1990s where Russia was so weak and they just can't get out of that frame of mind. They can't understand that, hey, that's not the Russia that exists anymore. But it's hard to, in the end, it's hard to explain. I mean, it's, you would think that one day they wake up and say, oops, wait a second, let's reassess our pulse. But it's never there for whatever reason. They're just, they are locked in to this view of the world, of themselves vis-a-vis Russia. And it's clear that I don't think any amount of logic, I think, again, like Russia has been slapping him in the face, and this most recent demonstration of power was meant to be that. It's like a slap in the face of a drunk man trying to get him to sober up, but I don't think it's going to work. At some point, it's, if they keep on, Russia keeps on going up the escalatory ladder, they're forced to by the continued provocations by the West, that you'd hope that at some point, even Keir Starmer and Anthony Blinken will say, oops, okay, yeah, we've gone too far. Let's cool things down. But you just see no sign of that yet.
Okay, well, let's move over to the Middle East and talk about this ICC arrest warrant. Arrest warrants were issued for both Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, and the charges to me sound very serious, as they should be, as they are. They include starvation as a method of warfare, intentionally directing an attack against the civilian population, murder, persecution, other inhumane acts such as torture and displacement. These are bad. This is and rightly so. I mean, so how damaging is this for Israel and Netanyahu?
Right. Yeah. Well, I'll first of all say I don't have any respect for the ICC. So, their judgment doesn't have any effect on my view of events. I do have respect for the ICJ. I think they actually did very good research. I know, for example, that John Mearsheimer, I think before the ICJ, the initial judgment, he was loath to describe Israeli actions as genocidal. But he carefully read all the evidence, that had been laid out in the ICJ charges, and he was convinced from that it was genocide. That court really did its work, but the ICC is just an instrument of the rules-based international order, or the international rules-based, or whatever it is. I forget what.
International rules-based order.
Yeah, right. And so, a lot of their judgments are just, of course, there's the one to arrest Putin for apparently kidnapping children. Nobody can point out which children were kidnapped, but, he's supposed to be, there's a warrant out for his arrest. And then later for Shoigu for attacking infrastructure, which is completely absurd because, of course, actually the Russians were very slow to go after infrastructure, while the Americans, in every war that they fought, whether it's Serbia or Iraq or whatever, that's the first thing you go after. They spend 2 months blowing up every last power plant and water treatment facility and, bridge and everything in the country. But so, there is no standard of justice with the ICC. So anyway, I just want to say that first. But this judgment, I think, really will have an impact, and it is going to, it further damages the reputation of Israel, because there are a lot of countries that are kind of sitting on the fence that are greatly disturbed by what's going on in Israel, but they're afraid of being accused of anti-Semitism. But, this judgment gives them cover. And I think neither Netanyahu nor Gallant is likely to ever be arrested. But I guess they're going to have to changed a lot of their travel plans and vacation plans because virtually or a large number of European countries have already said that they will be arrested if they step foot on their territory. Still, that's not a likely outcome. The important thing is that I think this gives cover and maybe impetus to different countries to maybe impose sanctions on Israel of one kind and another, economic sanctions or military sanctions. It's not going to have any effect in the U.S. In fact, we have Senator Tom Cotton saying that we should invade the Netherlands or something.
Right.
But yeah, it does hurt Israel. There's no question about it.
Well, you were saying that basically the ICC is an institution of the U.S.-led international rules-based order. But I think that makes it even more impactful, though. Just the fact that this is an institution that we set up that was created after World War II for us to control the world, to establish this rules-based order.
Right.
And now they have issued these arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, and the U.S. their immediate response from the United States is to say, well, now we're going to war against the ICC, against international law. This was our whole thing, right? That's what we've been touting since World War II.
Well, I think actually way back there was some move to bring charges against George W. Bush, and the U.S. made it clear back then they threatened the ICC, you're not doing that. And some people even use that same kind of language. We'll invade the Netherlands if we do it. So it's not the first time we've made these kind of threats. But it is important. It is very much an instrument of Western hegemony. So why did they do it? Well, I think it's clear, and it's also clear from the response that most of Europe supports it. I think even Joseph Borrell came out and said, yeah, we have to support this. It doesn't mean an abandonment of Zionism, unfortunately, or even of the genocide, really. It's just that I think it's like even we find within the U.S., there is a lot of resentment against Netanyahu. Like within the Democratic Party, a lot of Democratic congressmen and senators or whatever are angry at Netanyahu. Chuck Schumer, a long-time, very fervent supporter of Israel, condemned.
Technical difficulties. You're talking, I believe, about Chuck Schumer and how he was denouncing Netanyahu publicly.
Yeah. So, I think Chuck Schumer and many other Western leaders are disturbed. They understand that what's going on in Israel is a real bad look for Israel and for the West in general. I think it was Joseph Borrell just like a week or two ago was saying that, this is really hurting us. I mean, the rest of the world is looking at this and they're actually assigning part of the blame to us, the Europeans. We got to do something about this. And his solution was just pathetic, but that's something we talked about earlier. So there clearly is a great deal of concern. But yet all of them are still Zionists. They're still committed to the Zionist project. Chuck Schumer is no less a Zionist today than he was before he gave that speech. And, Macron, Starmer, they're all Zionists. But they know something's wrong. So for them, the solution is to get rid of Netanyahu, pin the blame on this one individual and say, he messed up. He did. They won't admit that he went so far as genocide, but he committed some war crimes. He handled this badly. The problem is Israel is still the most moral nation on the earth, and Zionism is holy. We all believe that, but Netanyahu has to go. And I think that's, again, why the ICC, which again is very much an instrument of the international rules-based order, they went along with. They probably had a lot of Western leaders saying, "Hey, get rid of Netanyahu, bring charges against him," and they think that actually could solve the problem. Of course, it won't, because anybody who replaces him is going to be, if anything, probably even more gung ho on ethnic cleansing and war with Iran. Yeah. And again,
right,
Netanyahu is not an outlier within Israel. He has a great deal of support. The majority of the population clearly support what he's doing. So, they're wrong about that. Just like their analysis, they can't really accept the reality, just like they can't accept the reality of Russia and Ukraine. They live in a make-believe world with respect to the Middle East.
Well, then, but at least some of these Western countries are at least recognizing that there are war crimes, that they will
that's
abide
true.
by this. But the U.S. is just, we can't even do that. We can't even say, like, look, we love Israel to death, but Netanyahu's gone too far. He's a bad guy. We can't even say that.
Some of
we
our
have to say that
politicians
he's
have,
the greatest.
but in general, no. You're right.
Right. Bernie Sanders has been doing good. He's trying to pass that legislation to stop more arms sales to Israel. But, I mean, for the most part, let me just read you some of... You mentioned Tom Cotton. I'm just going to read it out to you, his tweet. So he tweeted, "The ICC is a kangaroo court, and Karim Khan is a deranged fanatic. Woe to him and anyone who tries to enforce these outlaw warrants. Let me give them all a friendly reminder. The American law on the ICC is known as the Hague Invasion Act for a reason. Think about it." So what is he? Is he? You mentioned that it's like to invade Holland. Is he actually threatening to invade Holland? Well, what does he mean by this?
I don't think so, but you know, he is expressing just how that there will be consequences. You know, he's obviously using hyperbole here. I don't think anybody would go for an actual invasion of the Netherlands. You know, probably I'll have to eat my words in a couple of years when we do, in fact, invade the Netherlands. We always get, at this point, though, I don't see it happening. But he's just saying there are going to be consequences, you know, and probably there really will be. You know, they'll sanction some individuals. You know, they probably will make just the work of the court all that more difficult.
Right, and here's Lindsey Graham, what he said. He said, "I will soon introduce legislation that will impose sanctions on any country that cooperates with the orders of the court in The Hague. I don't care if it's Canada, France, Germany, or any other country. These arrest warrants are a threat to the U.S. and not only to Israel. We are next in line." Like, well, I want to actually talk about that, the idea that we are next in line. Like, that's true. If the ICC is putting out arrest warrants for Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, then shouldn't they also be pointing the finger at the United States? Because we are the ones?
We obviously are empowering and enabling Israel to commit these war crimes. There's no question about it. But I just don't see that happening. You know, first of all, it was never going to happen while Biden was president, because Biden he's just too much part of the establishment. They're not going to go after. They can decide to throw Netanyahu, you know, overboard. Actually, I think everybody's all these politicians, all these presidents and prime ministers have long hated Netanyahu. So I think that they would be happy to see him go. But Biden is one of them. They would just never let that happen, and I'm sure the court would just never even consider it. Now, it's an interesting question with Trump, you know, because Trump is so hated. You may find people arguing, you know, let's issue, a warrant against Trump if he does something, and he probably will, you know, to make the war his own, to actually empower Israel to do even more damage, and then that may be an excuse. I could actually see that happening because, again, he's not part of the establishment, and the Western establishment, the international rules-based order would very much like to see the back of Trump. They would like to get rid of him, just like they hope to get rid of Netanyahu.
So, are you saying that maybe one of the only hopes for Palestine right now is that the hatred of Trump when he gets in power and he continues this war might be enough? People might hate Trump more than they love Israel. To that point.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably true, but I don't think it's going to mean that the genocide will even be slowed down. I mean, just like getting rid of Netanyahu. First of all, you're not going to get rid of Trump. That it would be a symbolic gesture. It would be important. You know, there's no question about it. Again, I think it would damage the reputation of the U.S. So in the long run, it's going to be damaging to Israel and the Zionist project. But in the short run, it's not going to make any difference. I mean, the bombs are continue to flow to Israel from the U.S. and Israel will continue to ethnically cleanse and the Palestinians.
So, did you think that this ICC ruling, these arrest warrants, are very damaging to the United States as well?
Obviously not as damaging as they are to Israel. But anybody who looks at it closely has got to think, and they see it.
Right, and you read these tweets from Tom Cotton and
I think
Lindsey
that's
Graham.
going to hurt.
Just like, my God.
See how well, these other European countries like Germany, and Spain and Ireland, and and even Great Britain. Keir Starmer himself, I think, went and said, "Yeah, we'll honor this warrant if Netanyahu sets foot in the UK." But the U.S.
I think even Canada, I think even Trudeau.
Right. So anyway, the fact.
Not explicitly, but I did see something. He's like, we are a country of laws and we'll follow.
Right. So anyway, it does further isolate the U.S. There's no question. It's doing diplomatic damage, reputational damage to the U.S.
So, do you think there's any way that Netanyahu and Gallant will ever get arrested? They just won't step foot in these certain countries.
They'll make sure ahead of time, that they wherever they go. Again, with in the case of Putin, he's careful. Again, I think that whole warrant is just completely absurd, and that's why I have no respect for the ICC. But I think Kazakhstan was a signatory to the Rome Statute, but they said ahead of time, we're not going to honor this, and so Putin's been there, and he's been to other countries, where they've made it clear ahead of time. There was some question, like I think he was thinking about going to South Africa a year ago, and it wasn't. The South African government clearly, has very good relations with Russia, but they have, I guess, quite an independent judiciary, which they felt like they couldn't control, and it could create some domestic problems. Like their judiciary could actually have issued a warrant. I don't think that the South Africans would have honored it. I'm sure they wouldn't have, but it would create domestic troubles and conflicts within the country. So, Putin chose not to go there.
So if Netanyahu was arrested, Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, then who's going to run America?
Right, yeah. Our Middle East policy will be rudderless. Well, we'll just call him up in jail. It's just like a mafia don when he gets arrested. He still runs everything from the prison. So I think that's what happened.
Nothing will change. It's crazy. So, okay, it'll damage Israel's reputation, further isolates them, will hopefully give some ammunition to countries to build up the courage to impose sanctions on Israel. So there could be some actual effects.
I think that's
there's okay. And do you think that for the United States, are we adopting this position where we are kind of wanting to go to war against the international rules-based order?
Well, we're not going to go to war.
Starting to tear it down? Or tear it, but we're further.
Well, it obviously has created tensions within the international rules-based order. Let's put that there obviously is a point of disagreement here. Now, again, it is about really. It's more about tactics than strategy. It's about individuals rather than ideologies. Everybody is a Zionist in this international rules-based order, but almost all of them, have, with the exception of the U.S., pretty much has decided that we've got to get rid of Netanyahu here. And I think it suggests you just don't have anybody in Europe actually condemning Zionism and saying, in fact, this is a genocide and we need to stop it. But people like even Burrell, they're sort of, you can tell, they can't quite, they can't accept that reality, but they're being pushed in that direction, just by the reality. They're just, so I think this is a step that could be the beginning of let's say a journey away from Zionism.
Yeah, I always say this, that it's so hard for me to believe how captured all of our Western politicians are by Zionism. It's just so ingrained. It's really unbelievable, because I feel it just doesn't make sense to me. How can they control so much of the world? With the United States, the most powerful country in the world. You look at these tweets. Why don't we talk about America? Well, we got problems here. But no, it's clearly an Israel first country, and it's not only the United States. They have influence all over. And somebody else that we speak highly of, Viktor Orban, for example, he's great with Russia. But when this ICC warrant came out, he said slammed it and said he's going to be inviting Netanyahu over to Hungary as soon as he's ready to come. Why? Is there dirt on? Do they have dirt on?
Well, no, we've talked about this earlier, and it's quite unfortunate. The populist right, which is is very good on Russia, is with very few exceptions tends to be just terrible on Israel. So in other words, they want to end the war in Ukraine, and they understand the Russian position, but they're captured by the Zionists. And I think probably in the case of Orban, it's quite sincere. I don't know exactly what's behind it. I talked earlier about the off day, and this may also apply to some extent to the national rally in France. I think the support is really more of a kind of a political tactic. It's just that they're constantly these groups are constantly being accused of being fascist, and sort of like Zionism is sort of a kind of insurance policy that they take out against the accusations of fascism. You say, you can't call us fascists. We stand by Israel. I think I may have mentioned earlier that in fact, like the support for Israel within the base, let's say, like in Germany, like the AfD voters, it's actually very, very thin. A poll showed recently it was something like 19% actually were strong supporters of Israel. So it's not really there. It's not like in the U.S., where you have real true believers at all levels of society. I think it's in most cases, like certainly in France and Germany, it's more of a kind of it's a political tactic. And at some point, they may decide, as Israel becomes more and more of an albatross around their necks, they may decide to just forget and, dispose of Israel. I think that could happen much more quickly on the populist right in Europe than it could happen in the U.S., where you get, again, we have Christian Zionists and we have Jewish Zionists. We have true believing Zionists of all kinds in the U.S. I think less so in Europe. Yeah, it's unfortunate about Orban. The leftists tend to be much more consistent, I think, in their foreign policy positions within Europe. So you have Fico in Slovakia, Mélenchon in France, and Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany. All of them are both anti-Zionist and sympathetic to Russia.
They're just anti-war.
So they're being they're being consistent, and these populist right wingers are not.
Right, it's not a very difficult or complicated position to adopt. The anti-war position, but somehow it gets co-opted.
Well, again, it's just we've talked about Zionism is a very, very powerful force in this country. I think it's less so in Europe, but it still is. It's not nearly as powerful, but it's still a force there in Europe. But I think it's more of a, like within the populist right, they found themselves vulnerable to these accusations of fascism, which I think are completely absurd. But it's something that's continually slung against them. That's their efforts to ban the AfD in Germany, on the grounds that they're a crypto-fascist party. And so again, they just I think they use the pro-Israel position as a way of just protecting themselves, because they are under constant political attack there. It's a way of protecting their flank.
How does it protect
themselves? Okay, well, you can't accuse us of being fascist. You see, we love Israel. We love the Jews. Yeah, that works. It does to some extent. It does. It's because I know
it sounds like what I hear. Right. What I hear when you say that's like you love genocide, you love ethno-supremacy state.
Well, yeah, but that's what's happening in Germany as a whole. Germany is this post-war Germany is dedicated to being kind of like the anti-Nazi country, the anti-fascist country, right? And so part of that, it's not just the populist right; it's just the entire establishment is completely, has completely committed itself to the Zionist project and to backing up Israel no matter what. So they give Israel, it's like in the U.S., I don't think you have the popular support for this, but the establishment is as committed to Israel as the American government is. And it's because, it's just to erase the Nazi sin. So it's a very sensitive issue within Germany. So any association with the Nazi past, any accusation can be, a career ender. It can lead to the banning of political parties. That's just the way it is in Germany. Now, it doesn't make sense, right? You point out, hey, you're supposed to be anti-genocide, and now there's a country actually committing genocide, and you're protecting them. That's, of course, the reasonable response, and that's what, Sarah Wagenknecht and some others in Germany are pointing out. Now, at some point, because I said you don't have the social forces in support of Zionism there. It's not like the U.S. So I think at some point, it's possible, for example, the AfD can make a calculation as Israel goes further and further down this road to genocide and to infamy. They may at some point realize, hey, it doesn't really help us to be associated with Israel anymore. Let's throw them overboard. I think it could.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's some discussions. Like within the leadership of the party, but in general in Germany, like in the mainstream media, it's still like anybody who actually comes out against Israel is immediately pilloried and accused of being a crypto-fascist and so on and so forth. And people get arrested. I mean, like there have been various kinds of demonstrations, on behalf of the Palestinians, and the German police come down hard. They start cracking heads and throwing people in jail right away for, anybody who waves a Palestinian flag or anything. You can get in real trouble there. Oh, yeah.
Really?
Germany is not a very democratic country.
It's, you're talking about being anti-Nazi. It's like, okay, well, the Nazis are when I think about them, I'm like, okay, these are horrible people that started a world war, that killed millions of people, enacted the Holocaust, committed a genocide, right? Killed millions. And so that's what we should be against them. And then it's like, okay, well, that's what being anti-Nazi is, against world war,
you would
conflicts
think so,
and
right.
genocide.
Yeah.
And then you have a country that's committing genocide and trying to start
Right.
a global or at least a regional conflict with Iran. So the anti-Nazi position is to be,
right.
anti-Israel.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. No, you're right. You're completely right. But that's the way it is. I said it's the same thing in this country. It's a complete misapprehension, misuse of history. Right? You learn lessons from history, but it's not that, oh, the Jews are always the victims. Whatever. Yeah. And the threat is always from fascism, and they're kind of frozen in time, and just like the world. We're still living in 1939 or 1943 or something, and that's the world. We can never get out of that world. But obviously, the world has greatly changed, and anybody who, a thinking person, a moral person, needs to reassess and look around and see what's actually happening. That's the only moral way to behave, but that's not how they behave. They've just like the Jews are the victims. So just like as we said in Amsterdam. There were those riots that were clearly instigated by, the Israeli soccer fans, but it immediately was described as a pogrom, and everybody was, all these European leaders were bemoaning the fact that now we have a pogrom, right here on our territory. Isn't it horrible? The poor Jews, and because they're living in the past, they froze history back there in the 1940s, and then they refused to move forward and see anything that happened afterwards.
Okay, well, let's end it there, Dad. Okay, have a good rest of your day. Okay, bye-bye.